The 1992 Los Angeles riots slash rebellion actually begins a year earlier in 1991 with the Rodney King beating. This was a videotape of the police brutally subduing Rodney King, which was then beamed around the world. There was extensive media coverage of this incident. For example, the Los Angeles Times published 40 articles. The New York Times published 17 articles. The Chicago Tribune published 11 articles. And the ABC News telecasted 8. The 4 officers involved in the beating were put on trial, and a year later the verdict was announced on April 29, 1992. The case was actually moved from Los Angeles to Simi Valley, where jurors were from the San Fernando Valley, a more upper-class area of Los Angeles County. The jurors were 10 whites, 1 Latino, and 1 Asian. The jury, astonishing everybody, acquitted all 4 police officers on trial from assault and 3 out of the 4 from excessive force. Most Americans were baffled, regardless of race or ethnic background, but African Americans and other communities of color with a long history of police repression were particularly enraged. This culmination of police repression and disappointment with the justice system brought hundreds to the streets. The damages resulted in 58 deaths, 2,400 injuries, and 12,000 arrests. 3,000 businesses were damaged by burning, looting, and vandalism, totaling a loss of $800 million. South Central and Koreatown looked like it had been through a war. The governor called 6,000 national troops for order. During the riots in South Central, a white motorist, Reginald Denning, was pulled from his truck by several black youth and beaten in the street. Just a year before, images of white cops beating a black motorist was beamed around the world. Now, televised images played repeatedly of black youth attacking a white motorist. Reactions and responses from public figures varied, but many comments underlined the racial and class divide in America. Jesse Jackson, a longtime politician and advocate for the African American community, was quoted by saying, "The riots were an inevitable result of the continuing patterns of racism, police brutality, and economic despair suffered by inner city residents, a tinderbox of seething frustrations which was eventually set off by the verdicts." Bill Clinton, the Democratic presidential candidate at the time, is quoted by saying, "Violence resulted from the breakdown of economic opportunities and social institutions in the inner city. They are looting because they do not share our values, and their children are growing up in a culture alien from ours, without family, without neighborhood, without church, without support." Maxine Waters, an African-American congressional representative of South Central Los Angeles, is quoted by saying, "The events in Los Angeles constituted a rebellion or insurrection caused by the underlying reality of poverty and despair existing in the inner city. This state of affairs," she asserted, "were brought about by a government which had all but abandoned the poor through the loss of local jobs and by institutional discrimination encountered by people of racial minorities, especially at the hands of the police and financial institutions." President Bush Sr. at the time is quoted by saying, "This unrest was purely criminal." Though he acknowledged that the King verdicts were plainly unjust, he maintained that we simply cannot condone violence as a way of changing the system. Mob brutality, The total loss of respect for human life was sickeningly sad. What we saw last night and the night before in Los Angeles is not about civil rights. It's not about the great cause of equality that all Americans must uphold. It's not a message of protest. It's been the brutality of a mob, pure and simple. Vice President Dan Quayle blamed the violence on a poverty of values. I believe the lawless social anarchy which we saw is directly related to the breakdown of family structure, personal responsibility, and social order in too many areas of our society. While many assume that America reached a point of diversity, tolerance, and colorblindness, the verdict and ensuing riots/rebellions actually resurfaced the reality of the racial divide in America. The riots further challenged the public's understanding of the racial divide, meaning that we can no longer limit our thinking to the black and white paradigm. Racial tensions that manifested into violence was acted out by blacks, Asians, Latinos, and whites. In fact, Latinos were the largest group arrested at 8,000, while 700 whites were also detained. At the heart of racial tensions were actually class issues. Poor and working class communities of all racial and ethnic backgrounds were in competition of each other during economic recessions, in competition for the basic necessities such as housing, employment, and health care. In fact, during the riots, the police were not only ordered to retreat, but also to stop the spread of violence into neighboring affluent communities. The riots/rebellions put front and center the fact that poor communities, people of color, and immigrants lived in urban areas that were really isolated from mainstream America and the benefits and opportunities that missing from the media and national discussions, but voiced time and time again in Los Angeles' poorest communities, was economic decay and its consequences. Where does this economic decay begin? Well, we have to start with the 1970s and 1980s, where steady employment for the working class in Los Angeles began to disappear. Blue-collar jobs with factories such as Goodyear, Firestone, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, and American Bridge factories that provided thousands of jobs closed down. This resulted in poverty and increased welfare dependency. By 1990, the unemployment rate was at 30%. Layered on top of this was the conservative political agenda of the time, known as Reaganomics. This was massive in taxes that impacted social services, such as job training programs, healthcare, after-school programs, and education. In fact, by the 1990s, the California public school system was ranked at its lowest. Public schools spent some $2,000 less per pupil than the other states' average. Programs to keep youth in schools were being cut, and the high school dropout rate began to soar. In addition to this, police brutality was rampant. By the 1990s, Los Angeles, or the Los Angeles Police Department, already gained a notorious reputation for racial profiling and brutal approach in policing the black and Latino communities. Intimately connected to this police repression was the soaring California prison population, with a disproportionate number of blacks and Latinos in the prison system. Other characteristics of California and Los Angeles need to be mentioned. Los Angeles had the second largest homeless population. In addition, in a 3-mile radius of South Central, where the rioting was heaviest, there were 640 liquor stores and not one community center or movie house. By 1991, 600 youth were killed from gang or drug-related incidents in that year only. Thus, many referred to this event not as the LA Riots, but the LA Rebellion. Following the 1965 Watts riots, less than 30 years before, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was quoted by saying, "A riot is the voice of the unheard." Shortly following the riots/rebellions, Los Angeles communities began to rebuild, and many positive experiences began to evolve out of this process. One clear example was the peace truce between the Crips and Bloods and other various Latino gangs, where there was a short-lived but dramatic decline in gang-related violence. In addition, facelift programs pushed for community centers, parks, and the repairing of public schools. There were also several town hall meetings where discussions ranged from encouraging understanding and compassion for respective peoples to working together for justice. The response of local, state, and federal governments accumulated to the Rebuild LA project and campaign. In the end, and after the media hype and politicking, South Central, the hardest hit area from the riots, got a few movie theaters and mini-malls built, which most community leaders argued was another slap in the face, chump change compared to what is really needed to rebuild LA into a city with a sustainable economy where all can live and work in dignity.